Why do so many modern men struggle in relationships with women? Why do they feel lost, frustrated, or powerless? Nietzsche, the philosopher of strength and truth, gave us warnings long ago. His brutal insights reveal not just the mystery of women, but the weakness of men who cannot rise to meet them. Friedrich Nietzsche did not write for the faint of heart. His words cut like blades, sparing no illusions. And among his most controversial thoughts were those about women, thoughts that still echo today and reveal why so many modern men collapse in the face of feminine power. Nietzsche once wrote the haunting line, "When you go to women, do not forget the whip." For over a century, these words have been misquoted, misunderstood, and twisted to sound like the ranting of a misogynist. But Nietzsche, in his cryptic and provocative way, never intended to hand men a literal weapon. He meant something far more unsettling, something that slices deeper than any physical lash. He meant that woman is not a puzzle to be solved, but a storm to be endured, an enigma that cannot be flattened into neat categories or predictable behaviors. To stand before woman is to stand before something elemental, something untamed. The whip is a metaphor for the discipline, the strength, and the willpower a man must carry within himself if he wishes not to be crushed under the weight of her mystery. In Nietzsche's eyes, women were not creatures to be conquered in the shallow sense of ownership or domination. Rather, they embodied the chaotic and creative forces of life itself. They were closer to the raw pulse of nature than men, who often buried themselves in abstract logic and endless systems. To Nietzsche, man tries to calculate the world, woman is the world. She appears as contradiction, nurturing and destructive, soft and unyielding, comforting yet terrifying. He saw her as both muse and test. And in this paradox, Nietzsche placed his warning, not against women themselves, but against men too weak to face what women reveal. Think of the whip again. It is not to be held against woman, but against the man who approaches her. It is the whip of self-mastery, the reminder that he must have control over his instincts, his desires, his illusions. Without that whip, he is a slave to his own longing. Nietzsche understood that woman's power lies not in brute strength, but in her ability to expose the unprepared man. She holds a mirror to his weakness. She shows him how hollow his claims to power really are. The man who wants woman to be simple, to be predictable, to always bend to his expectations, is already a defeated man. For Nietzsche, woman was never to be reduced to a role or a category. She was always a riddle, and it is the strength of the man that determines whether he can stand in the face of that riddle without collapsing. In the old world, men often faced trials, wars, duels, hardships, and responsibilities that forged in them a certain hardness, a certain capacity for resilience. When such men encountered women, they came equipped with inner discipline, with the whip of self, command already in hand. But Nietzsche saw his own time changing, softening, dissolving that hardness with the comforts of modernity. And in that softness, men began to demand that women too should soften, that women should become less storm and more safety. Nietzsche despised this tendency. For him, to expect woman to be stripped of her enigma is to strip life itself of its vitality. Nietzsche's brutal truth, then, is this: woman does not exist to make man comfortable. She is not the cradle in which his weakness can rest. She is the storm that reveals whether he is capable of standing tall or whether he will drown. She is the eternal test of strength, and the man without his whip, the whip of willpower, discipline, and self-overcoming, finds himself broken long before he even realizes the trial has begun. Nietzsche never hid his disgust for the weakening of men in his age, and if he stood today, he would see an even more tragic sight. Modern men, surrounded by abundance and endless distractions, have become creatures of comfort. Their lives are padded by conveniences their ancestors could never imagine, yet this comfort has hollowed them out. Instead of warriors, builders, and philosophers, Nietzsche would see a generation trained to avoid pain at all costs, to run from hardship, and to beg for ease. In his language, they are men who lack a spine, men who collapse at the first strike of reality, men who no longer embody the will to power, but rather the will to safety. And it is precisely this kind of man who cannot stand before the enigma of woman without breaking. To Nietzsche, man was meant to be tested, hardened, and forced to grow through trial. The fire of existence was supposed to forge him into something sharper, more dangerous, more alive. But modern men hide from this fire. They drown themselves in screens, in empty pleasures, in hollow victories. Their strength is not tested in battlefields or great struggles, but in trivial competitions of vanity and imitation. When such men face women, they do not stand as individuals with depth and presence. They arrive already broken, hoping that woman will mother them, soothe them, and complete them. Nietzsche would spit at this expectation, for it is weakness disguised as love. He saw that men who lack willpower look at women not as mysteries to respect, but as sources of validation to consume. They come to women with empty hands and emptier souls, expecting nourishment, expecting affirmation, expecting salvation. But woman in Nietzsche's world was never meant to serve as a substitute for the man's lost strength. She was the storm that demands he be strong before he dares to approach. And when modern men fail in this test, they do not blame themselves. They blame women. They blame society. They blame everything except their own collapse. Nietzsche's words cut through these excuses like a knife. Weakness is not the fault of woman. It is the fault of man who has chosen the easier path, who has abandoned his own whip of discipline and his own responsibility to rise above comfort. The modern world, Nietzsche might say, breeds men who want to be liked instead of feared, who want to be tolerated instead of respected. They cannot lead themselves, let alone stand firm before a woman who demands presence. Their conversations become shallow, their desires enslaved to trends, their identities borrowed rather than forged. When faced with the raw, paradoxical nature of womanhood, its chaos, its depth, its strength, they panic, they retreat, or they crumble. Nietzsche's warning is brutal, but clear. The weakness of modern men is not merely a private flaw, it is a societal sickness, a collective decline of the masculine spirit, one that leaves them unprepared to face the storm of the feminine without shattering. Nietzsche never trusted the dream of equality, for he believed it was not born out of strength, but out of resentment, out of a quiet hatred for excellence and difference. To him, equality was a mask, a way of dragging down the strong to make the weak feel safe. When men and women were forged by hardship, when their roles were sharpened by necessity, life was dangerous but alive. There was tension, there was polarity, there was a creative force born from difference. But when society began to chase equality at all costs, it also began to flatten life into dullness. The result was not harmony but mediocrity, a weakening of both man and woman. Nietzsche would see in this pursuit of sameness a quiet decay of spirit, and he would call it a trap. Comfort is the natural companion of this trap. Modern culture preaches that comfort is the highest good, that to suffer is a failure, that to endure difficulty is unnecessary in a world of technology and convenience. And yet Nietzsche knew that comfort breeds fragility. He saw that true growth comes only through resistance, through danger, through the fire that tempers steel. Without resistance, without risk, a man loses his edge. He no longer sharpens his will, no longer rises above his own weakness. And when comfort dominates, he does not even realize what he has lost. He becomes proud of his softness, blind to the strength that has slipped away from him. This false dream of equality and comfort has poisoned the way men approach women. Instead of recognizing woman as a force to confront, modern men wish her to be an equal in the most shallow sense, predictable, safe, undemanding, identical in essence to themselves. But by doing so, they do not elevate woman, they diminish her, stripping her of the storm that Nietzsche described. They want her to be comfort when she was meant to be mystery, to be validation when she was meant to be trial. And yet, Nietzsche's insight strikes even deeper. By demanding this false equality, men have not made women weaker. They have made themselves unworthy. What happens when man demands that woman be stripped of her enigma? He faces not a companion of equal strength, but a shadow of what once was. He avoids the challenge, and in avoiding it, he avoids growth. Nietzsche despised this cowardice because he believed life itself thrived on challenge, on the tension between opposites, on the dangerous dance between man and woman. To erase this polarity is to erase vitality. It is not equality that raises men, but struggle. It is not comfort that refines women, but the clash of strength with strength, will against will. When this dynamic dies, when men and women are dulled into sameness, what remains is a quiet death of spirit. Nietzsche would see today's society as one where men retreat into roles of safety, celebrating their inability to confront woman as storm, and instead pleading for her to meet them on softer ground. In this, the very essence of masculinity dissolves, not because woman has conquered man, but because man has surrendered before the trial even began. There is a crisis unfolding before our eyes, and yet most refuse to see it. It is the crisis of the weak man, the crisis of a generation that has forgotten what it means to carry weight, to endure pain, to hold the line when the storm rages. The modern man has been stripped of his spine, not by accident, but by a culture that celebrates fragility, rewards passivity, and condemns the strength that once defined masculinity. What we witness now is not simply weakness. It is the glorification of weakness, as if fragility itself were a virtue, as if dependency were a crown to be worn with pride. Look closely at the men around you. How many hide behind screens, finding their courage only in words typed in anonymity? How many recoil from challenge, preferring the comfort of excuses to the discipline of struggle? How many collapse at the first taste of resistance, unable to stand when life demands a firm answer? This is not merely the result of personal failing. It is the design of a society that has turned men into consumers rather than creators, spectators rather than warriors, sons forever clinging to the apron rather than fathers shaping the future. The weak man is celebrated because he is harmless, and a harmless man poses no threat to the machinery of comfort. But harmlessness is not goodness. A weak man cannot protect, cannot lead, cannot inspire, cannot sacrifice, cannot even resist the tide that drags him into obscurity. And so he floats, soft and aimless, convinced that drifting is the same as living. Yet life was never meant to be a soft drift. It was meant to be a climb, a struggle against gravity, a war against decay. Without that struggle, there is no growth, no transcendence, no greatness. Once, men knew this. They bore scars with pride. They measured their worth not in convenience but in endurance. A man's strength was not just muscle or power. It was his ability to carry burdens without breaking, to stand upright when others bent, to give more than he received. But the crisis of the weak man has erased this memory. Today, fragility has replaced strength as the ideal. Men are told to be softer, gentler, endlessly accommodating, endlessly apologetic. They are told that to be strong is to be oppressive, that to be assertive is to be cruel. And so they shrink, apologizing for their very existence, hiding from the sharp edges of life. What happens when a society is built on weak men? It collapses from within. For when the strong are silenced and the courageous shamed, what remains is a mass of hollow shells, unable to defend themselves, unable to protect what they love, unable to create anything worth passing on. The weak man does not only destroy himself, he destroys his family, his community, his nation. He becomes a burden rather than a pillar, a liability rather than a legacy. And yet, society smiles upon this weakness, dressing it up as sensitivity, as progress, as enlightenment, when in truth it is nothing but decay disguised as virtue. The crisis of the weak man is not merely personal, it is cultural, civilizational. It is the slow erosion of the heroic spirit, the steady dismantling of the masculine will. It is the triumph of comfort over challenge, of safety over risk, of mediocrity over greatness. And unless this tide is resisted, unless men remember once again the necessity of strength, endurance, courage, and sacrifice, the world will be left with generations of men who look alive, but are already dead within. Nietzsche does not leave us with comfort, nor does he speak to soothe. He holds up a mirror, and in that mirror, we are forced to see what we have become. Modern men, stripped of their strength, dulled by comfort, intoxicated with equality, and terrified of woman's storm, stand trembling in a world that demands greatness but receives weakness. The brutal truth about women, as Nietzsche saw it, was never meant to belittle them. It was meant to remind men of the trial, the necessary challenge, the polarity that keeps life alive. Woman was storm, mystery, danger. And in confronting her, man sharpened himself, rose beyond himself, became more than he was yesterday. But now, in fleeing this trial, man has lost his own fire. He no longer meets storm with courage, but seeks shelter in softness. He does not rise to meet mystery, but demands that mystery lower itself to his fragility. In this retreat, he is not only betraying woman, he is betraying himself. The crisis of the weak man is not a private tragedy, it is a civilizational one. For when men refuse their burden, society itself collapses. Nietzsche's words are not simply philosophy, they are prophecy. They are a warning to those who believe comfort will save them, who think equality will heal them, who imagine softness will sustain them. The reality is harsher without strength, without polarity, without the storm life decays. The brutal truth is this: if men do not rise, if they do not reclaim the weight, if they do not confront woman as trial rather than comfort, then the world they inherit will not be one of peace, one of silent ruin. Nietzsche does not ask us to agree, he demands that we wake up. And the question that remains, staring back at us like fire in the night, is this: will modern men face the storm, or will they vanish into the quiet death of weakness?